As of patch 7.05, all Dawntrail dungeons, no exception, can be soloed by a warrior. Synced, if not by any tank. Even Dark Knight can get extremely far on their own. Simultaneously, a noticeable portion of players find Dawntrail dungeons so hard that if they're offered them in a daily roulette, they might actually just leave. So is quote-unquote casual content in Final Fantasy XIV too easy? Too hard? Are tanks too strong? Are other roles not strong enough? Which one is it? If it is one of them, or is it multiple of them, or outright none of them? Or is it something else? Let's talk about that. So, sometimes I do this thing I call the solo challenge stream, which I stream here on YouTube on this channel for those interested. The way this challenge works is not by using an alt to run through the game completely solo from the very beginning or something, but rather to see whether duties are possible solo when synced down. At times, we've even unequipped gear in A Realm Reborn duties to make it more fair. However, the journey of testing pretty much all leveling dungeons and a large portion of various endgame dungeons demonstrated that by the time Warrior gets Raw Intuition, very few dungeon fights are unbeatable by a lone warrior as a result of raw damage numbers. It is almost always because of DPS checks or some mechanic that makes a fight actually impossible to beat alone. That doesn't necessarily mean that it is easy to solo all the dungeons that can be soloed, but the fact that it is possible is relevant to this discussion. From A Realm Reborn to Dawntrail, if you picked a random dungeon, it is more likely a warrior could solo it than not. Why is that relevant? Well, a somewhat interesting clash that has come up more and more since Dawntrail, at least from what I can see, is the issue of group wipes, but not the tank. And the tank then solos, or attempts to solo, the boss over the next 10 plus minutes. This specific situation may likely have become more common due to more difficult mechanics in the Dawntrail dungeons, for example. But that does not change the fact that tanks were already able to solo dungeons, and they got better defensive cooldowns in Dawntrail. Tenacity also got better, separate video on that one, especially for taking hits. So it should come as no surprise that tanks, much more so than any other role, grew with the challenge of Dawntrail dungeons. This is also much more clear when you land in a dungeon with a tank that isn't entirely sure how to use their toolkit. Suddenly the healer has to go almost full heal spam just to make things work. Which also can lead into a whole conversation about how impactful it is to a group if a role is missing, which then leads into the whole thing with running duties without healers and all that, but that's a different story. However, it does lead back to the initial question of, are casual difficulty duties too easy, in the case of Dawntrail ones especially, too hard, or are tanks and possibly other jobs too strong? And the reason why this kind of discussion can be difficult is because there are indeed players on both sides of the spectrum. Some who feel the duties are way too easy, and some who feel the duties are so hard they can't even be bothered to do it more than the single time it was required for the MSQ, and then would even consider leaving just to escape it the next time. I'm sure you can see how it is kind of a lose-lose situation to adjust the difficulty of the casual difficulty content in either direction. Make it easier and more approachable, and the strong players that already found it very manageable feel like it turned into even more of a snooze fest in some cases. Make it harder, and now the players that were barely holding on by a thread now can't even do that. You could argue the content should be made easier because it is casual content. It should be simple to do, and the players expecting more should do extremes or savage or something. On the other hand, the distance between casual difficulty content and current extremes are so far from each other, in my opinion at least, that there is plenty of space for something in between that. Something challenging that is still designed to be beaten in one session. how do we find the right balance for that? Well, some of the Dawntrail duties are approaching this difficulty level, I would say. On the other hand, you could also argue the content should be made harder because by level 90, in such a long MMO as Final Fantasy XIV, surely you should be expected to be capable of a bit more than the bare minimum by that point. Many of the mechanics are similar in one way or another to mechanics used in the past. So, if someone is paying attention, they can probably figure out a Dawntrail dungeon boss on the go, based on the knowledge they accumulated as they leveled up through the story. Or what? Again, there are two slightly different reasons why that might not be the case. The first reason is that a lot of players, and I mean a lot, expect most daily roulette content to be something you can queue into and in a relaxed manner just puddle through without having to think too hard about it. Some might also be watching something on a second monitor or something while doing these duties. So, vastly increasing the difficulty of this content so that it now requires your full attention to beat sort of clashes with this philosophy that casual content, concentrated in daily roulettes, are meant to be easy. This also aligns with the fact that, from my observations, partly based on seeing levers in duties I go into, and being a replacement as a mentor, that the most likely duties people leave are duties that are considered more challenging, or sometimes time-consuming, and also Crystal Tower for whatever reason. Just to list a few: Dawntrail Trial 2, M2N, M4N, Ivalice raids, Neo raids, you know, duties that might require you to pay a bit of attention, and then also Crystal Tower again. So increasing the difficulty even further might actually make this problem even greater. The other reason, which might sound absurd after what I just said, is that a lot of the older content that is meant to teach you many of these things have been power crept so much over the years that some mechanics just never happen. Other times, you can completely faceplant the mechanic and still win. And the best avenue to learn how a mechanic works is, a lot of the time, if the group wipes as a result of failing that mechanic, because that prompts either the person who didn't get it to ask, or prompts someone in the group who knows to explain it. Picture this. You are a completely new sprout in Final Fantasy XIV. You see your first orange spread marker. You're not sure what to do, and you're a melee DPS, so you do nothing. You just ignore it and hope it goes away. You and the other DPS take a ton of damage. The tank takes a big hit as well. The healer casts Medica 1 or something, and everything's alright. What do you learn from that? Spread marker means you will take damage, but that's okay. Or maybe you notice the healer didn't take damage, so maybe you should have moved away. Oh well, it's over now, so never mind. Or picture this. You're a sprout. You might have seen stack markers a few times before, and you might even have seen what other players do with it. But given it wasn't on you, you didn't have to worry about what it means. This time though, it is on you. What do? You might have learned that the safest approach whenever bad things are on you is to run away, so you run away. Splat, dead. You get rest up, the boss dies. I wonder what I did wrong. Oh well, we won. Maybe next time. A lot of the fights that are sort of meant to be the tutorial of various types of mechanics are bested so easily nowadays that sometimes the boss doesn't even get to teach you the thing. But even if the attack landed, someone else is able to paint over the problem so quickly that it might not really matter. But then again, if these fights were made more challenging so you can't just paint over the problem like that so easily, then wouldn't that clash with the first issue? Now everyone has to pay attention again. And this problem also highlights yet another issue. If there is one thing a lot of players truly hate, it is going into a duty, getting invested and progressing through, and then, for some reason, a specific pull, or probably a specific boss, is unbeatable by this group. There's nothing that can be done, because the healer can't dodge this mechanic and then the group withers away, or the tank is taking too much damage, or something else. Incidentally, this kind of issue is possibly more likely in Dawntrail dungeons than in, say, Shadowbringers dungeons. I don't know. So, how do you make dungeons that can be beaten by almost any group, while also making sure they are actually challenging, without making them so hard that a group has to give up, while also having to consider that there are players of all skill levels, even at level 90 or above? How indeed. But then again, do we need to do all that? What if we just made it so that a tank cannot solo the dungeons, for instance? Or at least the bosses? Is there a way to add difficulty to doing a dungeon quote-unquote wrong without making it harder to do it normally? And what does that even mean? What if, when a player is dead in a dungeon boss fight, after a certain amount of time that they stay dead, the boss gets a buff that makes it do more damage? Of course, stacking per player. That way, if only one player is left alive, they're forced to hurry it up to finish it, or the boss simply forces them to the floor. On the one hand, that sounds like a simple solution to a complicated problem. On the other hand, this also severely punishes any group where one or multiple players simply don't get it, and would make it more likely that some groups simply would have to abandon because they can't do it. So that might not be such a good solution after all. These kinds of groups somewhat regularly survive by virtue of an amazing tank and or healer carrying the entire group by the scruff, which would probably not work anymore with such an implementation like this. Is that good or bad? Another idea is to put a soft or hard enrage on dungeon bosses. Either, after a rather lenient amount of time, the boss simply wipes the group, Savage Boss style, as a hard enrage. Or alternatively, when the boss reaches the point in its sequence where it starts looping mechanics, each loop is initiated with the boss gaining a damage buff that gradually accumulates to slowly overwhelm the group. The possible concern with the soft enrage solution is that some groups, perhaps groups comprised of not super great players, are likely to see multiple loops anyway, which means that this addition would make the game even harder. But only for the players that absolutely did not need it. And while it might block off tanks from soloing a fight, it wouldn't prevent a tank from holding the rest of their group hostage on the floor for 5+ minutes while they try to make that magic happen anyway, so it doesn't really solve the problem. The hard enrage solution comes with similar issues, obviously. There's also the argument that actively implementing something specifically to target tank soloing bosses like this is like trying to prevent a good tank from doing what they do best, simply because the rest of the group isn't as good. But then again, there's also a massive difference in many of the groups where this kind of issue can happen. Sometimes the healer goofs it up right at the start and dies, and both of the DPS jobs don't have a res and don't have sufficient healing to stay alive, so over time they die off and leave the tank alone. It might have been better to simply wipe it up and try again from the get-go if the healer died that fast, instead of sitting through 10 minutes of the tank fighting for their life to try and win alone. Other times, this is attempt number 5, and clearly, the only way the group is going to make it through is if the tank can do it, because no one else can, as it turns out. To put a cap on that discussion, the best solution I could think of to this problem that ultimately boils down to some players being held hostage by virtue of dying in combat, and the rest of the group insisting on trying to win anyway, whether possible or not, would be to add an option, probably not front and center, but somewhere, to start a vote to force the group to wipe. On the one hand, that could be a very funny trolling tool, but you know, reporting is always an option then. On the other hand, I can simply not imagine a group of players would go through the trouble of getting one random into the group, specifically a tank perhaps, wipe, and then repeatedly force the tank to restart a fight just for the lols. But what do you think? Now that Dawntrail has had a bit of time to simmer, do you feel that the duties in Dawntrail are too hard? Too easy? Just right? Or something else? Maybe really dumb? I don't know. And do you think there's a solution that could make everyone happy? I would love to hear about it in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, the DPS check timer on the final boss of the level 100 MSQ dungeon is dictated by a gauge filling up, obviously, which means that as long as the tank takes out the generators one at a time, they can slow down the gauge generation so much that it is perfectly possible for a solo tank to beat the check. Easily too. This is in strong contrast to both Endwalker's Tower of Babel and Felled Court of Troya, where the DPS checks are non-negotiable and require far too much damage to overcome. And for the Troya one, I'm talking about the first boss, not the ad phase on the last boss.